Hey guys, welcome to the fourth installment of the Novo Elements Roundtable on Supplementation. I'm joined by Mike Niejadlik, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and Jake Ormes. We've basically had a bit of a roundabout, so we're a little bit later than usual on getting this up. The only real thing to update everybody on is we took your feedback and we have made the transition to a podcast, so it's going to be audio only. And hopefully this works out. It's much cleaner. Everybody can understand everybody clearly and get the best possible content and answers. So that's the hope. So we will get started immediately. We have 5 questions this month. Thank you guys, as always, for your submissions. And let's get started. First question is supplementing with branched-chain amino acids still necessary or optimal if daily protein requirements are met and evenly distributed? If so, when? Mike Niejadlik, will you get us started there?
Sure. So if protein is being adequately met, there doesn't seem to be any extra benefit from branched chains. There might be a couple situations, though, that if protein's not being met, that they might help. So if someone is vegetarian, they're not getting a lot of high-quality protein sources. Branched chains can help get those amino acids. If someone isn't getting enough protein, branched chains can help to supplement that. And then branched chains can also be used as a fueling source during training. Although they are a bit more expensive, and you can also use carbohydrates to fuel inter-training. So they're not necessary, but there are some situations where they may be helpful.
Yeah, I think a big part of that question that you touched on is the difference between deficiency and adequacy. Just like what I think a lot of the questions are going to be here about, like any kind of supplements, especially vitamins, minerals, stuff like that. And the other part of it is that he didn't really ask, but I think is always a component to these questions, is what's the tangible difference from doing it? And I think that really gets broken down into what can you really justify for cost. I think if you're, buying them or supplementing them with what he said, if his daily requirements are met and evenly distributed, what's going to be the tangible difference of adding in branch chains? I think based on our own anecdote, I'm not going to speak for everybody. I definitely want to get everybody else's input, but my own anecdote for sure, adding those in with, I'd say the base of the pyramid already taken care of, which is eating enough protein and evenly distributing. What are you really going to notice? And it's not really going to be tangible. Maybe over the course of a year, there might be something, but again, to attribute that to just branch chains is going to be really, really difficult to tease out. It's more likely going to be attributable to your training and the adequacy of the more important things. So if you have the money and you could justify the what if, maybe, but again, one I realize I'm nitpicking with words, but they're never necessary. So you can eliminate that from the equation for someone who's already meeting all these other things, like Mike brought up. If there's potential areas of deficiency, they become more important. But it's definitely not something for someone who's taking care of that's all of those things that they need to be having branch chains, or they're just going to fail on gains. Anybody else have any input there?
I pretty much agree with what everyone else said. I think it's going to really depend on how, anal the person wants to be and how much disposable income they have.
Dr. Mike T? Sorry.
I would agree with everything that's been said. If anything, I agree. You could argue that maybe a theoretical benefit, but what we currently know now, there doesn't really seem to be a benefit.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jake. I didn't mean to cut you off. Do you have anything else?
No, I was just kind of trailing off.
I think this is just the one final point on it is it's a nutrient that is helping you kind of send a signal. It's not something that you can only see it as. I think at least a couple years ago when these were really getting popular, people saw it as like almost like, I remember the craze was putting a bunch of branch chains in a gallon jug of water and sipping it throughout the day, thinking that like you will be chronically anabolic. And that's not the case, nor is that something that you'd actually really want in reality. So yeah, I don't want to tangent off too far, but
yeah, I just had one thing to add to the whole jug thing.
Go ahead.
So with that, when people were with going through that fad, if you will, I think people often forget that even though it's not labeled, branch chains do have calories.
Yep.
So a lot of times individuals will, sip on those throughout the day, and then their caloric load just, it goes up and up, and it counts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that due to labeling requirements, you can't put a caloric content for single amino acids, which is strange because all these pre-workouts that list as 0 as well, that used to have arginine and have other amino acids, they do have energy. So that's a really good point. Man, that could get into a really slippery slope, so we'll stop there. But if anybody has follow-up questions with nutrition, we can certainly address those. Second question is, given that antioxidant supplementation may potentially hinder the beneficial training adaptations for athletes, would you still recommend athletes to supplement daily with a multivitamin? Or would you rather have them supplement with selective vitamins and minerals, such as calcium, zinc, vitamin D, etc.? Or perhaps reduce the frequency of multivitamin supplementation, such as twice per week? And then they thanked us for the content. So thank you for your questions. Mike, Dr. Mike T. Nelson, will you get us started there, please?
Yeah, so I agree that if you look at the research on antioxidant supplementation, I do agree that generally they could be seen to inhibit or mess up training adaptations for athletes. One of the bigger ones that was done was a super high dose of vitamin C, was done on our fuzzy little rat friends. And most of the literature, even in humans, if you look at single amounts, not so beneficial. The only caveats there may be vitamin D, possibly magnesium, maybe zinc. But in general, the more classic antioxidants, generally if they're given in high doses, probably not that beneficial. The other part too, like vitamin C, people have to remember is that depends on how it's given, and that at some level it becomes a pro-oxidant. Yep. So if you're taking vitamin C as an IV or oral, there's different pharmacokinetics with it and different properties, and that gets into potential cancer and other things we probably won't talk about right now.
Yeah.
At some point you may want it to be a pro-oxidant, but that's a separate discussion.
Yep.
So I would say that testing for most things are not so good either. I've checked into a little bit of, these companies that'll say, hey, just send us blood or whatever fluid and we'll tell you, every little nutrient you're deficient in. It hasn't really been replicated, that use their own proprietary testing. Some of the basic stuff like vitamin D is, pretty good. Looking at any type of fat or lipid, they're pretty good at. But if you're trying to get down to what level of antioxidant you need and you're trying to use testing, old school dietary recall is probably going to be the best, and just run it through software or find a nutritionist that can do that. So would I recommend then a multivitamin? I actually do. The reason for that is the studies, and there's not a lot of them, done on a higher quality multivitamin are, I would say, interesting. So one of them is called Shaken But Unstirred, Effects of Micronutrients on Stress and Trauma After an Earthquake, randomized controlled trial evidence comparing formula and doses. This was in human psychopharmacology. The lead researcher there is Julia Ruckledge. And they just compared two different formulas there. This was done. What's interesting about natural disasters is it's a way that everyone is under the same stressor. Now, they may view that stress a little bit differently, but it's across a mass population that they all of a sudden get whacked with this big stressor. So this one was looking at the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand back in 2011. There was a follow trial from her group again, done by Bonnie Kaplan. Randomized trial of nutrient supplements to minimize psychological stress after a natural disaster. This is in psychiatry research. And it kind of looks at a similar thing again. Both of them did seem to show that micronutrients, when people are under a lot of stress, are helpful. Catch about that is that they both used a pretty high dose blend of micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, that type of thing. So the caveats with this are, in general, that's in a population that follows a standard American diet, which is pretty crappy. So just getting them back to adequate levels is probably beneficial. Most people who lift and things of that nature are a little bit more good with their nutrition, for lack of a better word. The thing I would add with that, though, is that if you do a lot of dietary recall, and myself, I'm guilty of this too, you'll find that humans are creatures of habit. So their diet may look really good, and then you ask them again 6 months later, and holy crap, it looks the same.
Yeah.
So there may be things that they are missing and things of that. So what I do in practice is, if they can get through their physician a vitamin D test, or they live in a northern climate, that's probably good. Most people are low in vitamin D in general. Essential fatty acids, you can use an at-home test. There's one particular one that I use, and that'll look at blood levels and even cellular levels, and that's pretty accurate. Outside of that, if I think their nutrition's been relatively poor for some time period, I'll actually have them use multivitamin for a period of time, and then slowly kind of taper them off after a couple months.
Yeah, I'd like to know if anybody has anything to add there. I mean, I think you kind of covered everything. Anybody else input there?
Not me.
No, I'm good.
Yeah, so I'll just capstone, I guess, in response, a lot of things that stood out to me in your answer, Mike. One of them is that the cliche, the death is in the dosing. That really still applies, and I think a big aspect of that to remember is, when you take a multivitamin, you are literally taking that. It's a multi-nutrient cocktail. So you need to understand that most foods do not exist like that. And one of the phenomenon that we know happens is, if it's not adequately, I guess, formulated, for lack of a better word, with the right ratios, certain minerals will inhibit the absorption of others. So I think potentially for a practical thing for someone who's doing this, is what I do actually is I crack my multi in half, and I take a half dose in the morning, and then sometimes a half later, but with the condition that you're doing the things that Mike said, which is have a foundation. So get blood work, because if you have no frame of reference, you're just taking it and you have no idea. I mean, you could potentially be urinating it out, which is very common with high B vitamin supplements, or not really getting any effect, or you could potentially be in excess. And then without the blood work, I think, Mike, you brought up another huge point, which is having some basis for nutrient tracking software. They all do it. So if there's no need, then again, you can't be super adequate. And I think that's what a lot of marketing kind of sells you on the hopes of, is like, you're super great with nutrients now. And at this point, I don't think we have really any evidence other than the emergence of like the vitamin D stuff. So again, I think dosing is important, and having a frame of reference. Mike, anything in response to my response there?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The one I use is from Hardy Nutritionals. I like theirs. You also, exactly what you said, have to pay attention to how it's formulated. We don't have any data to show that if you're not in a deficiency, taking more is not always better. I think lifters in general make this mistake with zinc. I've seen a couple lifters over the past couple of years that were taking just astronomical levels of zinc, and you can start depleting copper and have other issues there too.
Toxicity is a real thing for isolated vitamins. So that's something to understand, is like these aren't, just because they're quote unquote natural doesn't mean they're inherently safe at any dose.
Without knowing all the specific forms, look at the magnesium. If it's magnesium oxide, in general, you can assume the whole formula is probably crap, because that's a cheap form and it's only absorbed at about 8%. Again, that's not the best indicator, but if you're looking for one thing to look to figure out if it's good or bad, I tell people look at the magnesium level and then look at the price. If it's magnesium oxide and the price is really cheap, I don't know. It's probably not all that helpful in my opinion.
Yeah, well, it's good to have at least a couple practical aspects of takeaways for people who are still going to utilize that. Let's move on to question 3, which is, should a vegan or vegetarian worry about leucine threshold per meal? Should the person supplement leucine with meals or branch chains with meals, or use some different strategy with supplementation? Mike Niejadlik, you want to get us going on that one too, since you kind of already addressed it in question 1?
Yeah, sure. So I think a good starting point is just to state up front that vegetarians don't have any increased protein needs, and that it is possible to meet protein requirements through vegetarian and vegan sources, but it can be a little bit more challenging, and especially when it comes to finding complete protein sources. Tying the other question in, this is where branch chains could help to fill in the gaps. So these individuals, they just have to be aware of what vegetarian or vegan food sources have protein, and they just have to be aware of complementing protein sources and varying them throughout the days and the weeks. So I wouldn't necessarily focus so much on hitting a leucine content per meal, and I would focus more on the bigger picture of hitting daily protein requirements and just doing that consistently.
Yeah, I think the only other aspect that I have to add in there is, remember also that dose, again, is an aspect here where you can eat more of a vegetable protein that might be lower in leucine and still hit that. So you don't necessarily need to supplement, but again, it might be a more calorie efficient way of hitting those thresholds by adding branch chains. I feel like we can probably break this down into a million different different analyses, but yeah, I think practically Mike's point is the biggest one, which is the major aspect is going to be in total quantity throughout the day. Jake, we haven't heard from you in a bit. Anything on that one?
Not specifically, no.
Okay. Dr. Nelson, anything?
No, I would agree.
Okay, let's move on. Question 4 is, should one cycle off caffeine if taking it for performance? If so, how long and how often and for how long? Perhaps the caffeine dose for benefits is higher than any normal intake. Personally, they've noticed that they develop a tolerance taking it 3 times a week, but they can almost avoid it if they only take it twice. They're 57 kilos and they take 320 milligrams of caffeine 3 times a week. Jake, anything there?
So when they say that they develop a tolerance, I guess I'm gonna take that to mean that when they go up to 3 times a week versus 2 times a week, they actually notice a significant difference between when they were taking the caffeine twice per week in the kind of subjective effect of the caffeine. And the reason I'm kind of assuming that is because when you ingest caffeine compared to a naive person and somebody who's never taken caffeine before, you're going to be tolerant to some degree. Because when you ingest caffeine, you're going to upregulate things called adenosine receptors and even acetylcholine receptors, which caffeine is actually trying to block. And by blocking those adenosine receptors, it's going to help essentially make you feel less tired or mitigate fatigue. So there's been studies that have shown that when you essentially stop taking caffeine after about 7 days, those adenosine receptors, so when you start taking caffeine, they'll be upregulated. So the caffeine's not going to be able to block as many of them. So the effect will be lessened. And that has been one of the theoretical mechanisms of how you become tolerant to caffeine. It looks like it's not that cut and dry and not that completely clear. But after 7 days, as I was saying, it seems like that upregulation begins to kind of start reversing. So I would say, as a kind of rule of thumb, that perhaps try taking nothing or no caffeine for 7 days and see how that works as far as getting the desired benefit that you want. I would also probably say at a dose of 300 to 320, it sounds like you're not taking it every day, but that is kind of on the high end in terms of body weight. That's a little over 5 milligrams per kilogram. So maybe try after kind of taking a little bit time away from it. If you can come back and maybe even take a little bit less caffeine if possible and get a similar effect, then it might be worth it to just take less from there on out. Yeah, a lot of it is going to be subjective and based on how you feel, but I would try to start lower after a period of time off and work up from there.
Yeah, I think that was a excellent answer, and I think the only thing that I'd really add in there is in that period of either reintroducing it or anything like that, don't forget that there is a difference between isolated purified caffeine and caffeine from things like tea and coffee, and that you're getting other compounds that actually have different effects with it. So when you reintroduce, you could also reintroduce at a lower dose something like a green tea and see if maybe you get the effects you're looking for with a lower caffeine dose. Because again, you have literally like hundreds or thousands of other compounds in there that do have synergy with caffeine. The other thing is in that off period, if you're struggling, but you don't want to go back to the caffeine excessively quickly, you can take L-tyrosine in higher doses, and it could help you subjectively with that perception of fatigue. It does take doses of like 15 to 20 grams. It requires high doses, and the really quick and dirty of that is it replenishes. It's the precursor for a lot of monoamines, like dopamine and stuff like that. So neurotransmitters that kind of help you feel stimulated. So those are just some anecdotes. Anybody else have anything to add to that question?
I had just a couple of things to add. I agree with your things. He said there, it looks like it's a cold brew, which coffee is very tasty in all forms, which I approve of. And as you mentioned, if it's an anhydrous type caffeine in a standardized dose versus coffee, not only do you get different polyphenols, as you mentioned, the caffeine amount can be massively different. So there's a very cool study called Caffeine Content of Specialty Coffees from the Journal of Analytical Toxicology from 2003 from Edward Cohn's lab. Actually, originally got this from Anthony Almada, told me about this. And what they found was that caffeine concentration varied from 259 to 564 milligrams per dose in the same coffee beverage obtained from the same outlet on 6 consecutive days.
Wow.
So they purposely tried to standardize everything as much as they possibly could. And what you see is a pretty massive difference in dose. My friend Dr. Lonnie Lowry has done a bunch of caffeine studies. So they, interestingly enough, use Starbucks Via, which doesn't appear to have as wide of a range, maybe due to the process that it goes under. But any type of standard brewed coffee can vary a lot. So when I work with lifters, I usually will try to transfer them to a known pre-workout type product or some type of just anhydrous caffeine, so we can keep an eye on the dosage.
Yep.
Because you may have your dosage changing and you're not really realizing it. The other part too is I think the literature's kind of out in terms of, if you're used to caffeine, do you see a drop in performance? I've kind of seen stuff both ways. You definitely will not, quote unquote, feel it as much. So the more psychological effects or the alertness, that can change. I'm not sure if we have enough data on the actual performance though. So I would ask them, do they maybe not feel as amped up, but is their performance still pretty good? And last thing, this is just more a personal thing. I try to take at least 2 weeks, once or twice a year, off all caffeine, if at all possible. I think I read somewhere that it takes about 2 weeks for the washout of the receptor, but I can't find any research that's looked at that to verify that at all, so it could be completely made up. But what I find is, invariably, whenever I do that, I always think, I've been using less caffeine this year than the year before. And then I sleep like 11 hours for 4 nights when I when I get rid of it, and I go, oh crap, I was probably higher than I thought it was. So
yeah, those are excellent excellent points. Thank you. Actually, that's really fascinating just to hear on the part about trying to standardize it. Anecdotally, I've noticed that in trying to extract caffeine from tea, is that like I'll watch other people do it, and they'll get like double the yield I will sometimes, and then sometimes I'll get a totally different yield. Obviously, there's way more variables involved there, like me poking around in chemistry versus actual chemists doing it. But it is something that I think is a phenomenon that I guess I'm just backing up what you've seen in research with my anecdote.
Yeah, and for tea, the brew time will make a massive difference.
Yep.
So if you do what I call I want the caffeine, not the polyphenols, I'll do the quick and dirty method, like throw the tea bag in there, 30 seconds, pull it out, and then rebrew it. So I'll drink that before I train, and then after I come back, I'll drink the tea that's been sitting there for an hour. And it's not perfect, but most of the caffeine will come out early in that process, and a lot of it later, there's not as much there, and it gets bound to the other compounds in the tea.
Very interesting point. I'm going to take that one for my own usage. Last question. How can consumers be sure what ingredients and percents who have listed, let me read that again to myself. How can consumers be sure what ingredients and percentages that are listed on protein mix labels, how can they be sure they're accurate? Some companies exaggerate claims and mislead their customers. So I'll just start off quick on that one. There's quite a bit of third-party testing now. I know one of them is Consumer Lab, which you can check. They do independent testing of the industry. They don't have every brand on there, but they publish all of their results. You do require membership for it, but it's definitely a good site. They have more than just the testing. Another one is, I think it's called Labdoor, which does more brands that are probably lesser known on there. Another one is see if you can find third-party lab work from the company who is making these claims, because they should be able to supply it and back up what they're saying. If not, I'd be very skeptical of what they're saying. But yes, I do. I think it's becoming more. There's becoming more consumer support for stuff like that. Another last one is the NSF certified for sport. That it definitely is reliable, but realize it's pay to play. So it's easier for larger brands to do that, and it doesn't mean that a smaller brand, because they don't have that seal, that they're not legitimate. So I think taking all those things into consideration will probably help. But I also think logic helps. Like if something seems ridiculous, it most likely is. And I would just kind of sniff around a little bit more and ask more questions. But you can always contact the brand or try to and see if you could get any kind of lab work to validate that, more than just a COA that's just printed on a piece of, standard paper printer and stamped by some generic stamp. Anybody else have any input on that one?
Yeah, I just have a super general one in terms of just supplementation in general. Just purchasing from trusted companies that follow good manufacturing practices, and what you had said, back up their claims with third-party testing. So that that can carry over to protein as well as other supplements to help you get sure what's on the label.
Yeah, at this point in supplements, it's becoming this more shift towards kind of pharma, because bigger pharma companies are taking over the companies that they're the brands that have prevailed and kind of withstood the test of time. So basically the pharmaceutical standards are getting put onto supplements, which is a good thing for people. So most are following GMP. I can't speak for every single one. Like usually those ones that you see just pop up and are selling stuff that was illegal a couple years ago, and it's now magically on the market for a couple months. Like that's stuff I definitely would be skeptical of. And then also just doing percentage stuff as well. Like roughly whey should be around 10% leucine, and so look at see what you can from the label. One of them is add up the amino acid profile if you can get it, and see if that actually equates to the total protein amount. Another one is look for other ingredients. Now that we've gotten talking into protein, so other amino acids or non-protein amino acids that are put into the mix there. You do want to check that out too, because it's definitely died off, but some will add like creatine and taurine and other stuff into their protein, and they'll use it to inflate the protein content that they label it as. They shouldn't be doing that. There was a lot of stink over that, but I'm sure there's still companies out there. So be as much an informed and educated consumer as you possibly can, and read, just basically add the stuff up, add the calorie content up when you look at the fat, carbs, and protein. So that's a really good eyeball test. And then I think the other one is asking questions and see if they actually have documentation for what they're stating. Anybody else have anything in closing?
I just had a quick one on that. Obviously, look at the cost. I've been shopping in some other popular mass stores that will remain nameless, and have a pretty good idea of the rough approximate cost of protein from a manufacturer. And they were selling it for right at cost or probably even below it. And I know they're not going to be losing money.
For sure.
Yeah, and it wasn't like they were trying to do it as a loss leader to get people into their brand either. It was marketed as one of their main items they're selling. So if it seems like really cheap, then you've got to kind of scratch your head.
Yeah, that should always be the first level sensor. I think there's one other thing I was going to say on that is look at that's one other thing that you'll get from the labels. Look at the serving size, and then also look at the percentage of that of those grams that are protein. So the highest you can get is WPI 90, which is a whey isolate, and it's 90% protein. So if there's a company that's either exceeding that, and so that just inherently won't make sense. I've never seen one, but again, just I guess full disclosure of being aware of things, but also kind of work back from there. There's also like 85% and 80, which is like concentrates and stuff like that, and lower. So you can use that also as a kind of measuring stick of if you're getting what you're paying for, which is, are you actually getting protein when you're buying a protein product? So again, these are a lot of really quick practical things you could do with your brain and a calculator without needing the lab work. But I do think lab work is definitely a big thing for peace of mind too. Anybody else? The crickets have arrived. All right, guys. Thank you for your questions again this month. Thank you, all of you guys, for being on again and your answers. We will be back this month with philosophy, and we'll talk to you soon.